The sun was a hammer blow upon the flat, cracked earth. She lay in the shallow depression, the last vestige of shade shrinking beneath a withered scrub, dust sticking to the sweat on her skin like a second, suffocating hide. Her throat felt fused shut, a dry, raspy pipe barely allowing air. Beside her, wrapped in a thin, faded shawl, lay the baby, miraculously silent, small chest rising and falling with terrifying slowness. Every instinct screamed to flee, to crawl towards a horizon shimmering with cruel mirage. But her limbs were lead, her will a frayed thread. She had fled something else first, something human, leaving behind cruelty and judgment that felt as vast and inescapable as this desert. They had left her here, stripped bare of everything but the life still warm against her side. Shame and despair were vultures circling in the hot, still air, their shadows invisible but heavy. She closed her eyes, focusing only on the faint warmth of the baby, a tiny furnace of life demanding her last reserves. There was no rescue coming from the place she had left, only the slow, inevitable surrender to the heat and the silence. Then, a disruption. Not the wind, which was still. A low, rhythmic thudding. Horses. Unbidden. A flicker of fear, sharp and cold, pierced through the heat-induced stupor. Who would be out here, in this emptiness? More of them? She tensed, pulling the baby closer, trying to press their forms into the earth, become part of the parched ground. But the sound grew distinct and steady. 2 horses. They crested a low rise, dark shapes against the blinding sky. Not riders in pursuit, but men. 2 figures slumped in their saddles, their postures speaking of exhaustion, not pursuit. As they drew nearer, their faces became visible beneath wide-brimmed hats, etched with dust and weariness, but something else too, a profound emptiness, a resignation that chilled her as much as her own. A man, older, with a sparse beard and eyes that seemed to look through the world rather than at it. Beside him, a younger version, perhaps his son, equally gaunt, equally lost. They weren't looking for her. Their gaze was fixed on the empty distance ahead, as if riding towards the edge of the world. They saw her then, a sudden halt to their slow, deliberate movement. Their eyes, lifeless moments before, widened, first with surprise, then something that might have been alarm. The older man dismounted slowly, his movements stiff, wary. He approached with hesitant steps, his gaze flicking between her and the bundle beside her. She couldn't speak, could only stare back, her own desperation reflected in the sudden, unexpected interruption of their grim journey. The son remained mounted, watching, his expression unreadable. The air crackled with a tension born not of threat, but of 2 separate, absolute ends colliding in the middle of nowhere. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes, the color of faded denim, settling on the baby. He knelt stiffly, his joints protesting, and offered a canteen. It was heavy, half full. The cap was unscrewed, presented without a word. Suspicion warred with a thirst so profound it felt like a physical pain. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, her movements slow and unsure. He didn't flinch away. She lifted the canteen, the metal warm against her lips, and tipped it back. The water was warm, tasting faintly of metal and leather, but it was water. She drank shallowly, cautiously, her parched throat stinging. Then, remembering the baby, she carefully angled the canteen spout, letting a few drops fall onto her finger, which she then pressed to the baby's lips. The infant stirred slightly, a tiny suckling motion. The man watched, his face impassive, betraying nothing of his thoughts. His son dismounted, leading the horses slowly towards the meager shade. He didn't approach her, but kept his distance, his presence a quiet, watchful anchor. When she finished, she offered the canteen back. He took it, screwing the cap back on. "Dust is bad out here," he rasped, his voice dry as kindling. It was the first sound he had made, flat and devoid of emotion. A statement of the obvious, yet it felt significant. A bridge built of necessity. She nodded, unable to manage more than a faint croak. He looked at the baby again, then at her. Ain't much water left. His gaze held a question, unvoiced but clear. What was she doing out here? Alone? With an infant? She couldn't articulate the layers of abandonment, the flight from a life that had become a cage. She simply looked at him, letting the raw vulnerability of her situation speak for her. He seemed to understand, or perhaps he didn't need to. His eyes held a weariness that spoke of his own burdens, a different kind of desert he carried within. He stood, his body aching. We was going this way. He gestured vaguely deeper into the emptiness. His destination, she suspected, was oblivion. Her arrival had clearly disrupted his trajectory. He hesitated, looking back towards his son, then at her again. A decision seemed to pass silently between them. Can't leave you here, he said finally, the words heavy with a reluctant duty. It wasn't kindness in his voice. Not yet. It was necessity. Survival. He looked at the baby again. Small one. He knelt once more, this time reaching a hand towards the bundle. She flinched instinctively, a protective surge, but his movement was slow, respectful. He gently touched the edge of the shawl, peering at the tiny face hidden within. A flicker, something unreadable, crossed his eyes. He stood again. Need to move before the sun gets higher. Got a few biscuits, he gestured towards his saddlebag. And a bit more water, careful like he wasn't offering salvation, just a temporary reprieve. Enough to make the next few steps. Enough to make the impossible seem merely improbable. The man, who introduced himself simply as Silas, and his son, Caleb, shared what little they had. Hard biscuits that tasted of dust and old grain, and measured sips of warm water. There was no talk of how she came to be there, no questions about her past. Their silence was a heavy cloak, but it wasn't judgmental. It was born of their own quiet desperation, their own journey towards an end they had chosen. She learned their silence was different from the world she'd fled. That world had judged loudly. This silence was a space where existence was enough. They helped her stand, steadying her when her legs buckled. Caleb, younger and less weathered than his father, offered an arm, his touch hesitant but firm. She felt a faint stir of something besides fear, gratitude, fragile and new. They walked slowly, the horses trailing behind. Silas took the baby, holding her awkwardly but securely against his chest. It was a shock, this tough, world-weary man carrying the fragile bundle. He didn't look at her, didn't comment, simply walked with the child held carefully. She watched him, this stranger who had been heading towards death but stopped for life. There was a quiet competence about him, a deep knowledge of survival etched into his movements. He knew how to pace himself, how to read the subtle signs of the land, how to conserve energy. Caleb walked beside her, sometimes offering support, sometimes just a silent presence. She began to talk to the baby, softly, hushed words of comfort and promise, her voice raspy but steady. It was for the baby she walked, for the faint warmth in Silas's arms, for the tiny life that tethered them all to this arduous path. The sun beat down, relentless, but the hopelessness that had been a physical weight upon her began to recede, replaced by a fierce, protective determination. She would not die here, not while this tiny life depended on her. The men who had come seeking their end had become instruments of her survival. It was a strange, unexpected turn. They found a small, rocky overhang as dusk began to paint the sky in bruised purples and oranges. Not much, but better than the open ground. Silas carefully laid the baby down on a saddle blanket. He built a small fire, just enough for warmth and to boil the last of their water. The silence settled back over them, but it felt different now, less empty, more watchful. The shared hardship had created an invisible bond. She saw Silas watch the baby, his expression still unreadable, but less remote. Caleb offered her another biscuit. She ate it slowly, feeling strength trickle back into her limbs. Sleep came fitfully, the desert noises unfamiliar and close. A coyote howled, a mournful cry that echoed her own past sorrows, but Silas stirred, a low sound reassuring in the dark, and the baby slept on, undisturbed. She woke before dawn, the air crisp and cold. Silas was already up, tending the fire. He looked at her, a brief, assessing glance. "Ready to move?" he asked, his voice still raspy, but holding a different note now, a quiet resolve. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were going somewhere. Together. The fourth day brought a sandstorm. It swept in without warning, a wall of grit and fury that engulfed them, blinding and disorienting. The sky turned an angry ochre, the wind tore at them, and the fine sand worked its way into everything: eyes, mouth, clothing. Fear, sharp and visceral, clawed at her. This was it, the indifferent power of the land rising up to reclaim them. Silas yelled instructions, his voice barely audible over the roar. He grabbed her arm, pulling her towards a cluster of large rocks, motioning for Caleb to follow with the horses. They huddled together in the scant shelter, turned away from the onslaught. Silas shielded the baby with his body, his broad back a solid barrier against the wind. She pressed herself against him, shielding the other side of the infant, feeling the rough fabric of his coat, the steady strength of his muscles. Caleb was a dark shape pressed against the rock wall nearby, murmuring to the terrified horses. The storm raged, a relentless assault on their senses and their fragile hold on life. Time stretched and distorted. All that mattered was the small space they occupied, the collective will to endure. She found herself mirroring Silas's calm, focused determination. Her fear didn't vanish, but it became a quiet current beneath the surface of action. She wiped sand from the baby's face, adjusted the shawl, held firm against the wind. There was no room for despair, only the immediate task of survival. When the storm finally began to abate, leaving the world coated in a thick, gritty film, they emerged, shaken but unbroken. The silence that followed the wind's fury was profound, ringing in their ears. Silas carefully checked the baby, brushing sand from her face, a tenderness in his rough hands she hadn't expected. She saw the exhaustion etched deep on his face, on Caleb's, but also something else, a flicker of triumph, the quiet satisfaction of having faced the worst and endured. They found water that evening, a small muddy seep hidden in a narrow canyon. It wasn't clean, but it was life. Silas filtered it through a cloth, sharing it sparingly. They made camp in the canyon, sheltered and quiet. That night, under a sky washed clean by the storm, dotted with a million uncaring stars, Silas spoke. "Lost the ranch," he said, his voice low, directed at the fire more than at them. "Drought, debts, everything." Caleb was silent, staring into the flames. It wasn't pity he sought, just stating a fact. Their journey into the desert, she realized fully then, had been an act of final, desperate defiance, or perhaps surrender. They had come to disappear, until they found her. A new understanding settled between them. They were all adrift, broken by different storms. But they were not alone. The baby stirred, a soft whimper, and Silas reached out without hesitation, a large finger gently touching the tiny hand. The act was simple, profound. Life finding a way even in the wasteland. The desolation she had carried, the shame of her abandonment, began to lose its grip. It didn't vanish, but it no longer defined her. She looked at Silas, at Caleb, these men who had been walking towards their own end, only to be intercepted by her beginning anew. Resilience wasn't just enduring. It was finding purpose in the unexpected, forging connection in the emptiness. The journey wasn't over, the future was uncertain. But as she looked at her sleeping child, held close by this unlikely guardian, a quiet strength settled within her. She was no longer just surviving. She was building something, a fragile, fierce hope born from the dust and the silence, walking forward with companions she had found where she expected only death. The desert, which had threatened to swallow her whole, had instead given her a new path, and the quiet dignity of walking it not alone, but with a future held warm in her arms and unexpected protection by her side.